Hello, welcome to another Nancy Drew book to game comparison video. Today I'm going to be talking about Ghost Dogs of Moonlight, and I'm kind of excited about this one because we're going to be comparing multiple stories with the computer game. So the first story we're looking at was published in 1983, and it's from the Nancy Drew Ghost Stories collection. It's the second story in this book, titled The Ghost Dogs of Whispering Oaks. The other story we're looking at is the novel Mystery by Moonlight, released in 2002. And these two books, or two stories, were combined to create the Nancy Drew game, Ghost Dogs of Moonlight, which was also released in 2002. And this one's going to be quite fun to look at because we're going to be seeing which elements from each of the two stories were taken to create the computer game and what elements were left out. And as you'll see, I think at least that they did a really great job of picking and choosing just the right elements to form a really good game. And so let's begin. So we'll start with the 1983 short story, The Ghost Dogs of Whispering Oaks. So we have Sally McDonald Butler, who is a friend of Nancy, George, and Bess, and she invites the girls to come out to this old family farm of theirs called Whispering Oaks. And it's essentially been abandoned. The family hasn't been there in years because at night, the place is haunted by ghost dogs. And Sally's great-grandparents, who are the ones who originally owned the house, it was after their passing that the hauntings began. And they had these 4 dogs who were very loyal to them. And when their masters died, the ghost dogs are said to have died of broken hearts. And the reason, supposedly, that they haunt the property is because they were not buried on the hill with their owners, as was their request. They were buried behind an ice house. And that is why they haunt the property. And another thing that the owners did in relation to these dogs they loved was they had these golden statues made to represent each of the dogs. And when the couple died, the statues were never found. And as the story unfolds, Nancy actually wonders, are they haunting the property because they're trying to lead to the statues? Not because they were buried in the wrong place, but it has to do with finding these family relics, if you will. But of course we learn that they're not real ghosts. So both of those theories kind of get washed away. These hauntings were perpetrated by real people. And I'll get to that in a moment. But first we'll just talk briefly about the characters. So we have Sally McDonald Butler, her husband Jeff Butler, Trass Sabuch, who is not in the book he's talked about, but he's since passed away. He used to look over the family property and was a neighbor to the McDonalds. And then his sons, Red and Jimmy Sabuch, who are present in the current story in the present time. And what we learn is that the Sabuch family, starting with Trass, had been sort of responsible for the fake hauntings. And this was because they wanted to find the gold casts. And the dogs were actually buried where they were supposed to be. Trass lied, said that they were buried behind the ice house. And this was to give a reason for the haunting. But of course, as already stated, the haunting is faked. No real ghosts involved here. But Nancy and her friends unearth the truth, and they also wind up finding the golden statues. So that is the short story, and it really is a short story. It's about 30 pages long, but it's a neat story, and you can already tell what elements from this story were taken and put into the game. But we'll discuss that in a little bit. For now, let's look at the other story that the game is based on. It's a Nancy Drew Digest paperback, which is a continuation of the Nancy Drew mystery stories. It's book 167, and it's titled Mystery by Moonlight. And there we see part of the title for the game, taken from this book already. So Bess and George are house sitting for relatives at Moonlight Lake. They call it the Fane Cottage. It's more of George's side of the family. And they invite Nancy and Ned to join them for a week. This is in August. It's summertime. They have the time off, and they think it'll be just a nice little summer holiday. However, they've been hearing strange sounds both inside and outside of the old house. So they hear sounds coming from the attic, but there is no attic. And they also hear like a woman screaming outside late at night, which is quite terrifying. So they have these strange sounds that they're hearing, and Bess thinks it's ghosts. Nancy intends to find out what's actually going on. And as the group discovers, a lot of the people they encounter are quite negative, and in particular about the north end of the lake, which is where the Fane Cottage is, as well as some other properties. Some of these negative people include a pair of bird watchers. They don't like all the sound, all the kids. There's a camp nearby, which at this point in the story has closed for the season. But there are too many interruptions, too much noise, and they're trying to capture a photo of a screech owl. There's also a camp leader who, it seems weird, would be a camp leader dealing with kids, but he is ultimately just a really negative, unfriendly fellow. And then there are also local activists. And the activists are particularly upset about the north end of the lake because they're trying to reclaim land that was lost to Indigenous people back in the Prohibition, when what was once a valley with a creek was flooded by the government. So all this land is now underwater. So they have kind of a grudge against the people who reside on that part of the lake. So as the week goes on, the teens also learned that a gangster named Mike Malone, who was really big during the Prohibition, he used to own the property that the Fanes now own, as well as a neighboring property. And there's the possibility of hidden valuables nearby. So now we sort of have a motive for some of the strange things that occur, because over the week that they're there, not only do they hear these strange sounds in and outside of the house, but they also see a figure sometimes on the lake late at night, and some other strange things that happen during their stay. So they start to connect these pieces and realize this might all have to do with Mike Malone. So the characters we have in the book include Emily Griffin, who is a young woman who is sort of a part-time journalist. She's working on a documentary and has recently bought the main part of the Malone property, which includes a house and a boathouse. There are Millicent and Casper Lawrence Jones. They are bird watchers. Steve Delmonico, who runs the camp during the summer, and he's still on site even though the camp season has just ended. Kevin and Dale Weyerhosen. Kevin's name actually isn't given, they just give Dale, but I've lumped them together because they are two workmen who, they do the job together. Ravi Bindrath, who is a friend of Emily, and he sort of shows up unexpectedly. And Jim Whitehall Evans, and he's sort of the lead activist that the whole community is very well aware of. As the story goes on, we learn that Emily, with the help of Kevin and Dale, have been dragging the lake, which is illegal, and the purpose of this was to find Mike Malone's hidden treasure. And Dale is actually rather vicious. Kevin is not a great fellow either, but we sort of learn toward the end that Dale is almost ruthless. There's this comment from Jim, so he's not a nice guy, and he sort of double crosses Emily. He tries to take the jewels from her, even though she hired him and Kevin to help her with her dastardly deeds. So that is the novel. So now let's look at the PC game. This is number 7 of the Nancy Drew Adventure series, titled Ghost Dogs of Moonlight. So it's a title that doesn't fully match either of the two stories, but has elements from both. So that was really nicely done. So in the computer game, we have Nancy, who drives out to Moonlight to visit her friend Sally McDonald, because she's requested she come, and she's quite frantic. Something is going on. And when Nancy arrives, she discovers that Sally's gone, and they speak over the phone, and she finds out Sally ran away because of these ghost dogs that come every night. And that's really why she wanted Nancy to come, to help solve this problem of these ghost dogs. What Nancy also quickly learns is that a gangster named Mickey Malone once lived on the property. He built the house, he had a cemetery in the back, and as we go through the game, we also discover a hidden speakeasy beneath the house, which also connects to the cemetery, which is pretty cool. And he had supposedly hidden gold from the hole in the floor heist at the house. This was just a rumor, but Nancy sort of finds, we'll call it proof, or at least notes that sort of state to the effect that this gold is here, and Mickey was responsible for this heist. So Nancy's trying to unearth who's responsible for scaring off Nancy and the previous tenants, because these ghost dogs appear anytime someone takes possession of the Malone house. And she's doing this amid threats to the property. And these are things like the well being tainted. We're assuming this. It has high levels of arsenic, which seem more than you would expect to naturally occur. Nancy also gets attacked and is put in a burning shed, so she knows that someone is behind these acts, and she's trying to find out who's responsible and why, and sort of, as I've kind of stated, figures out that it relates to Mickey Malone and this gold he's hidden nearby. So the characters in the game include Sally McDonald. She's just a phone contact, but she is the reason for Nancy's visit. Red Knot, who is a bird watcher. Ranger Jeff Akers. He's on one side of the lake and provides sort of information about the history of the place. Emily Griffin, who's on the other side of the lake, who owns an emporium and sort of helps Nancy out by providing batteries and things that she needs for her various tasks in the game. And then Vivian Whitmore, who we speak with twice on the telephone and is sort of a source of historical information specifically about Mickey Malone, his property, the speakeasy, and the entrance to it. And as the game unfolds, we learn that Emily is responsible for all of the trouble. She's created the hauntings using dogs to make them look like ghosts, and she's been dragging the lake, and she wants this gold. So that is the story of the game. So with that, I can now do a proper comparison between all three elements, which is, it's a bit complicated, but it's pretty fun. So start with the storyline. So the overarching theme here that is the same between all three mediums is Nancy is invited to a lakeside house that may be haunted, and a hidden treasure may be in the vicinity. That's sort of the broad strokes of what's the same. So then if we look specifically at the short story, the house is haunted by howling hounds. That's sort of key to the short story. In the novel, sounds are heard in what supposedly is a non-existent attic, and screaming outside the house. It sounds like a woman who's, in danger, and also strange figures on the lake late at night. There's also gangster Mike Malone, who lived on the property. So again, those are the key elements for the novel, which differentiate it from the short story. Then in the game, this is where we can see what was taken from each. The house is haunted by ghost dogs, so it's taken from the short story, and Mickey Malone built the house. That's taken from the novel. So then we look at the location. Sort of mentioned in the storyline, it's a lakeside house. In the short story, it's a place or a farm called Whispering Oaks. In the novel, it's Moonlight Lake in Lost Valley, Pennsylvania. In the game, it's Moonlight, Pennsylvania. So we see that the name of the place is taken from the novel. As to the state, Pennsylvania is the same between novel and game. Short story, it's not specified. So for all we know, that could also be in Pennsylvania. Could be somewhere else entirely. So now let's look at the characters, which is kind of tricky because I have to look at three mediums instead of two. So I'll start with Sally. So she's the reason Nancy is visiting Moonlake in the game. She's her friend, and she's concerned about, this history of a haunting at the property. So in the book, or in the short story, the house belonged to her great-grandparents, the McDonalds, and she and her husband, Jeff, want to move in. In the game, Sally buys the property, so it's not part of her family's, it's just not a family property. She buys it. So that's sort of the difference between that character from the short story and the game. Still a friend, still lives at this property, but Sally inherited it in the short story. In the game, she buys it. So then we'll look at Red. Red is a combination of characters from both the short story and the novel, so this is kind of neat. So his first name is taken from the short story. Red Sabooch was one of the criminals from the short story. And he's also a bird watcher, which is a hobby taken from the novel, because we have the pair of Lawrence Jones, that couple, they are bird watchers. So they've combined elements from characters from both stories to create Red Knot, which I quite like. Now, unlike the short story, and even unlike, well, I shouldn't say unlike the novel, unlike the short story, he's not responsible for any of the trouble at Moonlake. In the novel, you can't really say he's responsible for the screaming, because the screaming is a screech owl, but it ties back to the bird watchers. So Red is innocent in the game. He's not like his short story character. Next we have Jeff, who is so different, and this I quite like. So he's derived in part from both the short story and novel. So his first name is taken from the short story. Again, that's the name of Sally's husband, is Jeff. So Jeff is not her husband in the game, but Jeff is a character in the game. And as we know, Jeff Akers wants to expand the park property, and that's taken from the character of Steve Delmonico from the novel. Steve wants to expand the Moonlight Lake camp. So different elements, very small elements, but taken from both mediums, both book mediums, to create the character of Jeff. But ultimately, he's quite different, and the park ranger role that he has in the game is unique to the game. And I really like that they made that his character. I mean, they could have made him a sort of a head of a camp, but I think the park ranger role is better suited. I think that was a really good idea that Her Interactive had when they made the game and, altered his character. So next I'll look at Emily. She's the culprit, at least from the novel, not from the short story, because she doesn't exist in that game, or pardon me, in that version, that story. And she's taken from the novel, but some of her antics are taken from the short story, and that's where the ghost dogs come in. So in her original story, the novel, she is looking for this treasure hidden by Mike Malone, but she's not really doing much as far as haunting to the property that Nancy's visiting. In the short story, we have the ghost dogs that are attacking the house. So that element from the short story is taken and added to the character from the novel, and Emily, is making it look like the house is haunted by ghost dogs. So yeah, those antics are taken from the short story, but her character otherwise is taken from the novel. One thing I find really interesting is that in the novel, her great-grandmother Nellie was married to Mike Malone, so she has this family connection to this old gangster, and therefore she believes she's the rightful owner of these hidden jewels, and that's sort of one of her driving forces for trying to find this treasure. It's not simply out of greed, but she thinks she deserves it. It's part of her heritage. Even though they're stolen jewels, there's at least a locket that belonged to her great-grandmother, and that, at the very least, she wants to claim. But she would also like the jewels and the coins and everything else that was hidden together. And part of her character from the book, but not part of the game, is that she's a sort of a part-time journalist, and she's working on a documentary. In the game, she owns a store on the lake called M's Emporium. So her background is quite different between the book and the game. So there are a few more characters to look at. We have Ravi. So this is a friend from Emily's from school, and he's not in the game. He's not incorporated in any way. He drops by unexpectedly, and he turns out to be a wealth of information because he is working on a documentary about lost lands, which includes communities that were flooded by hydroelectric projects that the government had set up. And that includes Moonlight Lake, because it was one of these communities that was flooded. And so he's able to provide them with a bunch of information and make connections with people who provide more information. But again, he's not in the game, he's just in the book. Same goes with the character of Jim from the novel. So there's also a Jimmy in the short story. We're not even going to look at him. But Jim, Whitehall Evans, is from the novel. He's an Indigenous person, and he's one of the main activists trying to reclaim the land that was lost when the valley was flooded. The thing is, this storyline is not incorporated in the game, so his character wasn't either. Her Interactive didn't find a way to include him, which is kind of too bad. I mean, I like that the game only has 3 suspects. I think that's unique and kind of fun. But I do wonder how that storyline would have gone if they'd included Jim and this story. But that might have been too many elements. I mean, they'd already taken the ghost dogs part of the story, apart from the short story, and then the Malone story, and the more of the Moonlight Lake or Moon Lake setting from the novel. So that might have been too much to include the activists' storyline. And then the final character is Mike, or Mickey Malone. His name has changed a little bit. In the novel, he's Mike Malone. In the computer game, it's Mickey Malone. So he's originally derived from the novel, and he was a gangster during the Prohibition, and he owned a house on Moonlight or Moon Lake, and he had hidden stolen jewels in the book, but also bars of gold in the game, and he hid them on the property. So we have sort of a few differences. Or in the novel, he's aware of the plan to flood the valley. He's got all these connections, with corrupt officials, including people in the government. So he knows there's a plan to flood the valley, and he's going to use this to his advantage. He buries his treasure in an area that's going to be flooded, and only he and his wife Nellie know about this. And the plan is for Nellie to retrieve it, but the government keeps a close eye on her even after her husband's been arrested, and she's never able to retrieve the stash. In the game, rather than this element of the valley being flooded, he had built a secret speakeasy with a bunch of tunnels which connect to the gold. And you can kind of tie it to flooding, because in order to get to the gold, you do have to deal with some water levels. You could flood the space that Nancy enters. So they do kind of tie it back to that element of the story a little bit in the game. But ultimately it's underground, and you have all these puzzles that you have to solve in order to find the gold bullion. So next, just a few more short things, just 4 things, just these 2 actually. We have the burial of the dogs and their headstones. So again, this is from the short story and incorporated into the game, and I just wanted to mention that this was something that stayed the same. So the house's owner, so the McDonalds, their dogs had died shortly after the owners, and they were buried near them, and there were headstones made for each of the dogs. So that part of the short story was put into the game, and their headstones do provide clues to where the gold is. In the book, it's about these gold statues. In the game, it's about gold bullion. So that little, very small element from the short story was also kept in the game. I thought that was noteworthy. And then I also want to talk about the use of the lake. In the game, Nancy travels by boat across the lake to visit both Emily and Jeff. In the novel, they don't use the lake as their mode of transportation. They just hop in a vehicle and drive to Lost Valley, which is the nearby community. But they do utilize the lake in the book. They go canoeing, they go swimming, but ultimately it's not a means of reaching their destination. So that's unique to the game, and it's kind of neat. I really like it. It suits the setting very well. So now we can basically conclude. So looking at the computer game, her interactive seemed to me anyways, to perfectly capture key elements from both the 1983 short story and the 2002 novel. They melded the 2 stories wonderfully to create what I think is a really fun and spooky game. And it's set at this lake, which I really love. I love this outdoor setting, and I like that it relates to history from the Prohibition era. So they're putting in elements of real life into it, and it makes for a really neat story. I really like what they've done, and it's really amazing to me to read the 2 stories and see what they were able to create from it. I just think it's inspiring. They did a great job. Kudos to Her Interactive for what they managed to do. And some of those things that they did, so they took characters from both stories. So Sally, Emily, they changed characters like Jeff and Red, but still managed to incorporate them. They also took various events, like the fallen tree. At the beginning of the game, Nancy's stuck at Sally's house because a tree's fallen down. It's blocked her car and she can't leave even if she wants to. That's actually from the short story. When the girls first arrive, someone, in the case of the short story, has actually caused the tree to fall. They sort of deduced that it was meant to fall on the car to stop the girls. But they managed to get in, and the tree falls behind them. So there's a small element taken from the short story that was included into the game. The house being attacked by ghost dogs, that's also from the short story. Dragging the lake for artifacts. We don't talk about it a whole bunch in the novel, but that's where it's from. And that's also how the gold, or jewels, because that's the primary thing, that's how those are found in the novel. But dragging the lake is a topic that's covered in the game, and we know Emily in the game does do that. And then we also have a relation to Malone's gang that's taken from both. So as we know for the game, we have Jeff Akers. His grandfather, William Akers, was sort of like Malone's, second in command. So they have this close tie, and Jeff is really embarrassed about this. He tries to hide this. In the novel, A Mystery by Moonlight, it's Emily who has the connection, and it was her great grandmother Nellie, who was wife to Mike Malone. So they've changed it a little bit, but they've still incorporated this element of a relation to Malone's gang, which I think is pretty cool. The game also had some unique elements, so things that were created just for the game. They weren't taken from either story. So that includes the ranger station and the role of having a park ranger. The saloon and tunnels, which I think are really fantastic. And real dogs. In the short story, that's where we get the element of the ghost dogs. There aren't actual dogs involved. It's the Sabuch brothers who have these gloves with battery-operated lights to make them look like eyes. And they're dressed all in black, so you don't actually see the shapes of dogs. You just see their eyes glowing and moving around the property. But it's people pretending to be ghost dogs. In the game, Emily has 4 real dogs, and she puts this glow-in-the-dark toothpaste to make their teeth glow, and so this headgear to make it look like their eyes are glowing. So they're real dogs involved in the game. So that's a little different, and I quite like that change. The game, as already noted, also eliminated the Native American activist. So this history of the indigenous peoples losing their land has been taken out. It's not included in the game. And same goes with the Valley flooding storyline, which ties back into the activist storyline. So overall, though, even with the little changes that were made, both things that were removed and things that were added, the game's storyline is basically the same as both stories, and it's really an exquisite blend, in my opinion. I love what was taken from both stories and turned into the game. And it's consistent, this storyline of being at a lakeside setting, which just makes my heart soar. I think it's beautiful. There's a haunted property, and there's a hidden treasure. It's just so well done. And these are 2 great stories. I love that Her Interactive figured out that these 2, The Ghost Dogs of Whispering Oaks and Mystery by Moonlight, would blend so well together. And what I also think is amazing is Mystery by Moonlight was released in 2002, and so was this game. So they were on it. They read this story, I guess, right away and thought, this is what we're doing. And someone must have read the short story around the same time and knew, well, we got to do this too. These 2 work perfectly together, and they did. I'm just in awe. So there we go. Like, I'm just amazed by how well this game came together from these 2 stories. I mean, it's not surprising because the 2 stories do fit so well together, but I am just amazed by how successful, or how successfully they merged all these elements and formed a great game. I mean, I love this game. I love that it's outdoors, because we don't see much of that in the Nancy Drew series, unfortunately. I'd love to see more. I have ideas if anyone's interested. But yeah, I really like this, and I really like the stories on their own too. If you ignore the game, I think the short story, The Ghost Dogs of Whispering Oaks, is really neat and spooky. I mean, it's short, so you don't build up a lot of anticipation, but it's a fun story. I really like the idea. And Mystery by Moonlight, also on its own. I love that setting of being on the lake and having this mystery and this gangster storyline is just so cool to me. I mean, it's not something I've studied a lot or read a lot about, so for me it stands out and it's quite interesting. And yes, these 2 stories together make such a wonderful game. This was one of my top games for years, and in some ways it still is. But I think it's just a great storyline, very unique, and really, as I've said, so well done. So what a great game, and I hope you guys enjoyed this comparison. I'm really hoping you're able to read both the stories and then compare it to the game yourselves. I think you'll find it really fascinating and interesting. So I'm going to leave it there. Thank you very much for watching. I don't know when I'm going to do my next videos. It's becoming a busy season for me, but I am looking forward to doing the next one, which will be the Haunted Carousel. So thank you very much for your time. Have a great summer, everyone. If you're watching this, around the time it's come out, we're just about entering summer. It's early June. And keep well and safe and have a great time. Thanks very much. Bye-bye.